Frank Delaney's Lincoln Town car was missing. Not parked elsewhere. Not in the shop. Just gone. The air was still soft with early spring warmth as sunlight filtered through the magnolia leaves outside the kitchen window. Ellie stirred scrambled eggs in a cast-iron pan while her grandfather sat at the small round table, flipping through the latest HOA bulletin with the kind of composure that came only with age, or decades in litigation. "They're updating landscaping guidelines again," he murmured, adjusting his glasses. "Apparently begonias are discouraged now." Ellie laughed under her breath, plating breakfast. "That's a crime in some counties, isn't it?" Before Frank could answer, the sound of the front door creaked open as a breeze passed through. It wasn't until Ellie glanced out the driveway window that her brow furrowed. "Where's your car?" Frank didn't look up. "Probably where I parked it. Left side, under the oak." She wiped her hands on a towel, stepped onto the porch, and stared at the empty space where the Lincoln usually sat, a faded rectangle of clean concrete marking its absence. "Grandpa, it's not there." Frank stood, slower than she liked, and joined her on the porch. His eyes narrowed slightly, lips drawing into a firm line. A voice called from across the street. "Hey Frank. Thought you took that boat of yours in for a wash." Eugene Tran stood watering a narrow flower bed, baseball cap tilted back on his head. Frank stepped down the stairs, hands behind his back. "Eugene, when's the last time you saw my car?" "This morning," he said, wiping his brow. "Right before sunrise." Flatbed truck pulled up, Topro logo, same one that took Marcia's Camry last week. They didn't even knock. Ellie joined them, arms folded. "No notice?" Eugene shook his head. "None that I saw. Marcia said they told her it was non-operational because of a flat tire. Hers wasn't flat." Frank turned back toward the house without a word, motioned to Ellie. Inside, he picked up the cordless phone and dialed the number printed on the HOA bulletin. A polite recording guided him through 4 options before a final voice announced, "Please leave a message. We will return your call within 3 business days." He hung up, then glanced toward the dining room cabinet. A slim red binder sat inside. Ellie spoke first. "We should go down there. The HOA offices open on Tuesdays, right?" Frank gave a small nod. They walked the 3 blocks in silence, past manicured lawns and birdbaths shaped like pineapples. Willow Creek streets were quiet, lined with homes painted in variations of coral and sky blue, all under the watchful eye of uniform regulation. The HOA office was tucked inside a converted garage beside the clubhouse, its frosted glass door bearing the stenciled words, "Willow Creek Property Management." Ellie pushed it open, and a blast of air conditioning hit them. Karen Holloway looked up from her desk. She wore a lavender blouse, hair pinned tightly, lips stretched in a controlled smile. "Frank, Ellie. What a surprise." "Morning, Karen," Frank said mildly. "We noticed my vehicle's missing." Karen clicked her mouse twice and turned her monitor outward slightly. "Yes. It was towed this morning. Section 4C, Vehicle Storage. Your Lincoln hadn't moved in over 72 hours. Per policy, we flagged it." Ellie stepped forward. "That's absurd. He drove it 2 days ago. We went to the diner." Karen shrugged. "We can only respond to what we observe. The patrol reported it as stationary for 4 consecutive days." "You didn't knock? Call?" Ellie asked. "We posted a flyer last week. Section 4C allows action without further notice if a violation continues." Her voice was syrupy sweet, but the undertone was stone. Frank simply adjusted his cuff. "Could I see the documentation?" Karen handed over a printed form, already signed. On top of it, she placed a folded paper, clearly a fine slip. "The tow fee is separate," she added. "But this is a $250 citation for unauthorized vehicle storage. You're welcome to appeal, in writing." Ellie opened her mouth, but Frank's hand on her arm stopped her. He glanced at the paper, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Karen resumed typing, her fingers quick and efficient. They left without further exchange. Outside, azaleas bloomed along the walkway, a premature flush of pink that clashed with the HOA's bland beige sign. Ellie's steps were tight and quick, her breath clipped. "She's unbelievable," she muttered. "You should have said something." Frank didn't break stride, eyes on the sidewalk ahead. "She just made this very interesting." Frank didn't call a lawyer. He made tea, opened a dusty red binder labeled Willow Creek HOA Rules, 2012, and flipped to Section 4C. Steam curled from the rim of his chipped mug as he settled into the armchair beneath his law degrees, the leather sighing beneath his weight. The late afternoon sun filtered through gauzy curtains, warming the faded rug and the hardwood floor beneath it. Ellie leaned over the desk across from him, a pen tucked behind her ear and her laptop open, half covered in HOA documents they'd printed from the neighborhood portal. "You ever think about updating this thing?" she asked, nodding toward the binder as she gently turned its brittle plastic sleeves. Frank sipped his tea. "The bylaws haven't changed much. Just the people who think they can bend them." Ellie let out a small huff. Section 4C. Vehicles must be maintained in roadworthy condition and moved within 72 hours to avoid classification as static storage. She looked up. "What does that even mean? Who defines roadworthy?" "And we moved it." Frank took the binder from her and began making light pencil marks in the margin. "Poorly written. Vague on purpose." He flipped 2 more pages, then gestured. "Look here. Enforcement steps, requires reasonable notice, except in emergencies. And this doesn't qualify." Ellie scrolled through the HOA's newsletter archive on her laptop. Karen's new update started about 2 months ago. She's tightening rules, calling it a Spring Standards Initiative. Frank didn't answer immediately. He reached for a second binder, this one marked Annual Financial Reports. Ellie raised an eyebrow. "You kept those?" "I was on the finance subcommittee for 4 years, he said mildly. "Old habits." Outside, the rhythmic buzz of a hedge trimmer faded, replaced by the distant bark of Truman, the neighbor's corgi, followed by a mumbled apology and a "Now, Truman, not everyone wants to hear your opinion." Ellie smiled faintly and returned to the screen. A new message pinged. "Eugene." "Hey Ellie. Just got another warning. Apparently my melons are unsightly. Who decides that? A fruit council." She laughed and showed Frank. "Eugene's being fined again. For growing food." Frank nodded without looking up. "Last year they fined him for putting his trash can out 10 minutes early." "I'm posting," Ellie said, opening the neighborhood forum and typing carefully. "Hi all, has anyone else had trouble understanding the vehicle storage rules? We just had a confusing interaction and would love to know how others interpret Section 4C. She hit send. Within minutes, a private message arrived. "I'd rather not say this publicly, but yes. We had a similar issue last fall. They said we left a canoe on the driveway too long. It was there 3 hours. Then another. My cousin had her pickup towed while visiting. Said it didn't look residential enough." "What does that even mean?" Ellie looked up. "They're scared. Or embarrassed. Maybe both." Frank nodded slowly. "Or unsure of their rights." A few minutes later, Karen posted publicly. "A gentle reminder, the Willow Creek Forum is a place for constructive dialogue. Any statements implying wrongdoing or administrative failure may be removed per guidelines. Let's keep things neighborly." Ellie read it aloud, her tone dry. "Let's keep things neighborly." "Right." Frank stood and moved toward the bookcase, pulling down a slim manila folder. "Sometimes people rely on civility to mask authority abuse. Doesn't last." They worked quietly as the light dimmed. Ellie reheated leftover soup. Frank hummed along to the soft notes of a jazz record she'd found tucked beside the old stereo cabinet. It skipped once but kept playing. Later, while looking through HOA's publicly posted budgets, Ellie narrowed her eyes. "Grandpa. He looked up. This towing company? Sunrise Recovery Partners. She pointed. Got paid $8,400 last quarter. That's a lot of tows. Frank reached for his glasses. Ellie clicked again, opening a separate browser tab, typed in the company name, followed by Florida Business License. A few seconds later, her screen displayed a registration form. Owner, Daniel G. Whitaker. She paused. Isn't that Karen's cousin? Frank finished quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling like dust. Ellie closed the laptop softly. Is this legal? Frank didn't answer right away. He simply set down his teacup and stood. Time to say hello to an old friend. The nameplate on the downtown brick building read, Delaney, Klein and Brody LLP. Ellie blinked. Wait. That's you. Frank gave a slight nod and opened the heavy wooden door with a familiarity that didn't need explanation. The foyer smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon polish. Ceiling fans turned lazily above dark wood paneling, and the air inside was a few degrees cooler than outside, despite the humidity that clung to the sidewalks of downtown Tampa. A woman at the reception desk looked up and gasped softly. Frank Delaney? Frank offered a small smile. Hello, Marcia. My goodness. It's been 10 years, she said, already standing to round the desk. Linda's in. I'll buzz her. Before Frank could respond, Ellie leaned in and whispered, Are you going to explain any of this? Short version, Frank said, adjusting his collar, I co-founded the firm. Retired 10 years ago. Linda stayed. A low buzz sounded and the frosted glass door to the side clicked open. A woman in her early 60s stepped through, gray hair tied back, crisp blouse tucked into a navy skirt. She broke into a grin. Frank. I thought I heard ghosts. They embraced briefly, stiff at first, then warmer. Linda looked over his shoulder and extended a hand to Ellie. You must be the granddaughter. Ellie, she said, still stunned. I thought we were just going for coffee. Linda smiled. This will be better than caffeine. Come on in. They passed through a hallway lined with framed articles and legal awards. Ellie glanced at one near the end, Franklin Delaney, architect of HOA Reform Bill 1993. Her eyes widened. Inside the office, sunlight streamed through slatted blinds, casting lines across legal books and an antique desk piled with paperwork. Linda gestured toward two chairs. Sit. Tell me why the founder walks in after a decade, with backup. Frank explained calmly, the fine, the towing, the shady contract, the cousin's company. He placed a folded copy of the HOA's quarterly budget on the desk. Linda reviewed it, frowning. Same contractor for 3 years. Paid directly from discretionary funds, no line-item approval. She opened a file drawer, removed a binder labeled Residential Governance, Florida Statutes, and flipped rapidly. They're violating procedural transparency at minimum. Possibly fiduciary duty. Ellie watched, slightly slack-jawed. Is this really that serious? Frank met her eyes. When power goes unchecked, even the small kind, it metastasizes. Linda looked up. You want to push this quietly or raise a flag? No press. No letters to the editor, Frank said. Just a court motion. Temporary freeze of discretionary spending. Let the paper do the speaking. Linda leaned back, tapped a pencil against her notepad. I can file it with the Hillsborough clerk today. Ellie turned to Frank. Why not just fight loud? Rally the neighbors, make it public? Frank folded his hands. Because silent chess wins longer games. Linda smiled at the line, as if hearing it for the 100th time. 2 hours later, the petition was drafted, signed, and sealed. Linda placed it into a thick envelope, scrawled the clerk's address, and handed it off to a courier already waiting in the reception area. As they left, Marcia reached into a glass jar and pressed something into Ellie's palm. A peppermint, she said. Just like your granddad used to hand out before court. Outside, the sun had shifted. Shadows stretched longer across the sidewalk, and the air felt heavier with the promise of rain. Ellie watched Frank straighten his blazer, steady as ever. Across town, Karen Holloway stood under a white awning beside the clubhouse, chatting with residents while paper lanterns swayed overhead. Her smile widened when the delivery driver approached with the envelope. She thanked him politely. Then she read the sender's name. And the smile slipped. The HOA hall smelled like lemon cleaner and tension. Half the neighborhood had shown up, the other half had opinions anyway. Rows of metal folding chairs squeaked under shifting bodies. A bowl of warm, red punch sat neglected near a tray of off-brand cookies. Ellie placed a small plate of homemade snickerdoodles next to them, soft centers, sugar crusts, and stepped back, her eyes scanning the room. Karen stood at the front of the hall beneath a plastic banner that read Willow Creek, Together in Harmony. She wore a pale blue blazer and a smile so tight it could cut thread. Ellie leaned toward Frank. She's in campaign mode. Frank didn't respond. His gaze was already trained on the rows of clipboards stacked on a folding table near the lectern. Karen tapped the microphone twice, then launched into her opening. Neighbors, thank you for joining us tonight. It is our shared commitment to civic order that makes Willow Creek such a desirable place to live. A few nods. One cough. The ceiling fan above whirred on low, pushing the scent of furniture polish through the space. Lately, Karen continued, we've seen a surge in misunderstandings. It's important to remember that the HOA's role is not punitive, but protective. Ellie began moving down the side aisle, quietly placing stapled packets on chairs, excerpts from the HOA bylaws, specifically sections 4C and 8. Several residents blinked, surprised. Others leaned in. Karen's smile flickered, just for a second. To ensure fairness, she pressed on, we've recently revised enforcement protocols. These align with community standards, standards we all voted to uphold. A hand rose. Eugene Tran. Yes, Eugene. About those protocols, he said, standing. Who voted on those changes? Because I don't recall seeing anything on the agenda. Karen gave a short laugh. Mr. Tran, procedural updates don't always require resident vote. You're welcome to file a request if you'd like clarification. But please, no disruptions tonight. Eugene stayed on his feet. I'm not disrupting. I'm asking. Karen tilted her head. Please take your seat. Eugene held her gaze for a beat, then slowly sat. Murmurs rose like cicadas at dusk. From the back, Ellie held up her phone. Just high enough. Frank's voice was steady. Madam Chair, may I ask a question? Karen folded her hands. Of course, Frank. Has the board solicited bids for our current towing contractor? And is the vendor relationship disclosed in the quarterly statements? Karen's smile cooled. That's a matter for internal review. But it involves resident funds, he replied. Surely that invites community input. Someone from the third row whispered, he's got a point. Ellie's fingers moved quickly. She uploaded the clip of Karen silencing Eugene and declining Frank's question to the community forum, captioned with just 2 words, tonight's meeting. A few phones buzzed almost immediately. Karen's voice rose half an octave. We cannot allow misinformation or misinterpretation to derail what should be a productive gathering. Frank remained seated. According to the charter, Section 8, any resident may request a budget hearing. Publicly. If supported by quorum. The room hushed. Several people turned to the packets Ellie had handed out. Karen's eyes narrowed. That's not how we usually. But it is how the rules are written, Frank said gently, not looking at her. An older woman with silver curls leaned over to Ellie and whispered, reminds me of Nixon, only with begonias. Ellie bit back a grin. Karen stepped away from the podium. She walked to the side table, hands twitching near the clipboard pile, then turned back toward the crowd. The mood had shifted. As murmurs grew, Karen glared at Frank. "We'll see about that." The certified envelope arrived at HOA headquarters with a heavy thump. The staffer looked at it like it might bite. Karen Holloway reached for it slowly, as though the weight could be felt in her bones. The envelope was thick, hand-delivered, stamped with the seal of the Hillsborough County Clerk. The name on the sender line was familiar, Linda Klein, ESQ. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she walked back into her office, closed the door, and sat down hard behind her desk. She took a moment to stare out the narrow window where the clubhouse fountain gurgled quietly under the mid-morning sun. Then she slit the envelope open with her fingernail. Her eyes skimmed. Froze. Skimmed again. Court order, temporary injunction. Freeze of all discretionary HOA accounts, effective immediately, pending review. She reached for her phone and dialed the number for the HOA's legal advisor, the same one she'd found through a neighbor's nephew. It went to voicemail after 2 rings. She called again. Still no answer. Karen's hand trembled slightly as she placed the phone back on the cradle. She turned to the drawer on her right, pulled it open, and stared at the expense spreadsheet she'd had Miles print the week before. Her finger tapped beside the row labeled, Sunshine Municipal Services, March Towing Budget. She noticed, belatedly, how absurd it looked, $2,800 in 1 month for a neighborhood with fewer than 90 homes. Back in Frank's living room, Ellie handed him a fresh cup of tea. She glanced at his face, quiet but unreadable. "So, it worked?" Frank nodded, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "It's only temporary, for now. But it's like turning the lights on in a room someone hoped would stay dark." Ellie leaned against the armrest. "Karen'll go nuclear. She'll try to act like nothing's changed," Frank said, "but there are limits now. Public money can't be moved without accountability." At the HOA office, Karen slammed the file drawer shut and pulled out her cell. She scrolled to Miles's number and tapped it. "Can you come by?" she said, skipping pleasantries. "Now." When he arrived 20 minutes later, she was pacing. "Did you know about this?" she snapped, waving the court order. "Did Frank say anything to you?" Miles stepped back, surprised. "I haven't talked to Frank since the meeting." "Well, you need to," Karen said, setting the paper down with a smack. "This is bad optics, Miles. You're on the board. You can't just sit quietly while this circus plays out." "I'm not sure silence is the problem here," he muttered. Karen rounded on him. "Excuse me? You authorized thousands of dollars to go to your cousin's company. For towing. Without a vote. You bought me a conference badge last month with HOA funds. For community development. Remember that?" Karen's voice dropped. "Networking is part of the board's role. You're a future leader. You needed to be there." Miles shook his head. "The optics on that are worse than a court order." Across the street, Ellie was watering the potted geraniums outside Frank's porch when she saw Eugene approach. He looked unusually serious, his mouth drawn in a tight line. "You got a minute?" he asked, glancing toward the window. "Sure," she said, setting the hose aside. They walked toward the gate, out of earshot. "Karen's pushing Miles hard," Eugene said. "She wants him to defend her publicly, probably get in front of residents at the next meeting, make it sound like all this is just paperwork noise." Ellie frowned. "What does he think?" "He's conflicted," Eugene said. "But there's more. He told me something off the record, said some of last year's spending reports are missing. Originals. Might have been deleted from the HOA cloud." She felt her stomach knot. "Did he say who deleted them?" "No," Eugene said, "but he's scared. You can see it." That evening, the HOA board met privately in the clubhouse's small side room. Frank didn't attend. He didn't need to. Karen sat stiffly at the head of the table, while the other board members, Miles included, reviewed the injunction. When the motion came forward to suspend her discretionary authority until the hearing, no one seconded it aloud. They just signed. Karen didn't speak. She couldn't. The next morning, a second envelope arrived at her door, this time by certified mail. She opened it in her kitchen, still wearing slippers, a cup of coffee untouched on the counter. It was addressed to her personally. Subpoena. The contents listed a demand, her personal emails, phone records, and messages related to Willow Creek HOA business from the last 18 months. She dropped into a chair, hands flat on the table, staring at the name in the signature line. Linda Klein. Karen's lawn hadn't been mowed in a week. For Willow Creek, that was political collapse. The untrimmed blades curled slightly in the spring heat, contrasting sharply against the precise edges of neighboring yards. Weeds flirted with the walkway. Curtains stayed drawn. Across the street, Frank's backyard came alive. Folding chairs formed loose clusters under a string of soft yellow lights. Plastic tables held platters wrapped in foil and handwritten labels. Ellie carried a tray of lemon bars past the grill while Frank, steady in pressed slacks and suspenders, placed tongs beside a cooling tray of sausages. Backyard diplomacy, Eugene murmured, unfolding his lawn chair with a squeak. This is how revolutions start. Ruth appeared next, her deviled eggs resting in a crystal dish wrapped with a tea towel embroidered "Bless this mess." She set them down carefully, then adjusted her cardigan despite the warm breeze. I told Joseph, she said, motioning to a stocky man arranging bottled water, if I'm going to eat over there, I need to know where the chicken salad came from. Not from Karen's fridge, that's for sure. Joseph chuckled, shaking his head. This is the most neighbors I've seen in one place without name tags and an agenda. Ellie poured lemonade into paper cups. That's the point. No agenda tonight. Just conversation. By the time the sun began to dip, more than 20 people had arrived. Retired couples. A few young families. Even Dina, who organized choir rehearsals at the local church, brought a basket of cornbread muffins and set them next to Ellie with a knowing smile. Eugene opened a folder. I found old meeting minutes from 2016. Karen started using discretionary funds for maintenance contracts that never went to bid. All marked board approved, but I only count 2 signatures. Frank nodded, flipping through the pages. That's likely a charter violation. Ellie watched as neighbors leaned in, nodding quietly. She spotted Miles at the gate. His shoulders were squared, but not stiff. He looked hesitant. Guilty. Ruth saw him too and paused. Then stepped aside, making space. Miles crossed the yard slowly and stopped near the drinks table. I wasn't invited, he said, voice low. Ellie met his eyes. You're still welcome. A few heads turned. Conversations hushed. He glanced around and exhaled. My mom bypassed vote procedures for at least 3 major expenses, he said, louder now. She told me it was standard. That if you wait for consensus, nothing gets done. Joseph folded his arms. That's not how we built this place. She called it efficiency, Miles said. But it wasn't. It was control. Ruth touched his arm. Thank you. Someone asked what came next. Ellie looked toward Frank, who gave a slight nod. We need to call for a vote of no confidence, she said. Not to humiliate. Just to rebuild. Quiet agreement followed, nods, murmurs, one person clapping softly before stopping, unsure if it was appropriate. Miles reached into his jacket and handed Frank a folded document. My affidavit. I'll sign whatever's needed. From the house across the street, curtains stirred. A pale shape shifted behind the glass. Karen stood alone at her window, watching the soft glow of gathering, the gentle rhythm of neighbors finding their voices. Later that night, Ellie posted a photo to the community forum, Miles standing behind the backyard table, paper cup in one hand, deviled egg in the other, Ruth beside him. Karen logged in moments later. She saw the photo. Enlarged it. Zoomed in on her son's face. And sat perfectly still. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom, just beige walls, a flickering light, and a quiet judge with no patience for nonsense. Frank adjusted his tie as he sat beside Ellie in the second row, behind the wooden partition. The civil courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and lemon disinfectant. Dust motes drifted in and out of view through streaks of sunlight filtering between the blinds. Linda Klein sat at the petitioner's table, calm and composed, her hands folded neatly over a manila folder thick with evidence. The gallery behind them was full. Ruth clutched a floral handbag in her lap, Joseph stood with a straight spine near the aisle, and Eugene had even put on a collared shirt. A few others, faces familiar from porches and potlucks, filled in quietly, a soft solidarity filling the air like static. Karen Holloway sat on the opposite side of the room, her blazer a sharp shade of cream that clashed against her stiff posture. Next to her was a young attorney in an ill-fitting suit who shuffled his papers nervously. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Harmon entered without flair, her silver hair pulled into a no-nonsense twist. She took her seat, gave a brief glance at the docket, and got to business. "Petitioner," she said. "Proceed." Linda stood. "Your Honor, this case regards temporary injunctive relief based on financial misappropriation and procedural violations by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, specifically by its sitting president." She moved through her argument with surgical precision, dates, amounts, and charter clauses. She detailed how discretionary funds had been diverted to a towing company connected to the HOA president's family. She displayed the failure to record votes for significant budgetary items. She outlined the non-disclosure of expenditures, referencing scanned meeting minutes and time-stamped forum messages. The opposing attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we contend these decisions were made under emergency conditions, as permitted under the HOA charter." Judge Harmon looked over her glasses. "What emergency constitutes purchasing a $1,200 conference badge for the president's son?" Silence. "And how is a neighborhood vehicle patrol an emergency requiring $8,400 in one quarter?" The young attorney began to mumble something about operational discretion. Judge Harmon held up a hand. "Counsel, you've had 15 minutes. I suggest you use the next 5 to find something solid." Karen shifted in her seat but said nothing. Linda gestured toward the gallery. "We have a sworn affidavit from board member Miles Holloway." Gasps rippled. Miles stepped forward. In his blazer and jeans, he looked both like a son and a citizen. He spoke calmly, citing internal memos, the lack of votes, and his increasing discomfort with the process. Karen stared straight ahead, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Judge Harmon nodded. "I've reviewed the affidavit." Frank stood briefly. "If I may, Your Honor, Section 9, Paragraph D of the Willow Creek Charter outlines that any discretionary spending beyond $2,000 must be approved by majority board vote and recorded. It was a clause I helped draft." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're the Franklin Delaney from the 1993 HOA reforms?" "Yes, ma'am." There was a pause, like a courtroom holding its breath. Judge Harmon flipped to a page in the binder before her, then closed it with finality. "This court finds that the Willow Creek HOA has violated its own bylaws concerning financial oversight and governance procedure. The petition to freeze discretionary assets is upheld. The acting president's authority is hereby suspended pending a full internal audit. A temporary resident-led council will be installed to ensure continuity and compliance." Karen didn't react. Not outwardly. Ellie glanced to her side and noticed Ruth dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed tissue. Not angry tears. Relief. As the room emptied, Miles looked at his mother once, then looked away. Outside, the spring air felt brighter somehow, the sun brushing across their shoulders like an affirmation. Ellie turned to Frank. "Was that it?" Frank smiled, soft and certain. "That was justice, quiet but final." The next HOA meeting wasn't held in a hall. It happened under a magnolia tree, with lemonade and folding chairs from Frank's garage. Birdsong filled the air as neighbors trickled into the backyard, many of them carrying something, a casserole dish, a pitcher of iced tea, a basket of napkins. Frank's old card tables were lined up end to end, covered in mismatched tablecloths. At the center, a clipboard rested beside a neat stack of blueberry muffins and a hand-lettered sign, Resident Council Draft, Feedback Welcome. Ellie adjusted the stack, nudging the clipboard slightly to catch the sunlight. A light breeze rustled the magnolia leaves above. Nearby, Ruth organized name tags, handing them out with the efficiency of someone who'd once run bake sales like military campaigns. Miles arrived with a tray of iced coffees, greeting each person with a quiet nod. He paused when he saw Frank, who was arranging 2 chairs near the edge of the gathering. "Frank," Miles said. Frank looked up, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to say," Miles swallowed. "I'm sorry. For going along with it. For not speaking up sooner." Frank considered him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "You spoke up when it mattered. That's what counts." Miles exhaled. "Thank you." Ellie stepped forward and tapped the side of a mason jar with a spoon. Conversations faded into anticipation. "Thanks for coming," she began. "We know it's been a long few weeks, and none of us expected to be rewriting the way Willow Creek works. But here we are, together." She held up a sheet of paper. "The new proposal includes term limits, rotating leadership, and full budget transparency. No more silent votes. No more mystery contracts. And every 6 months, a community review." She looked around. "We want a system that serves, not controls." Ruth clapped first, firm and decisive. Joseph followed. Soon, hands were raised across the yard. It was unanimous. Eugene leaned back in his chair and grinned. "Think I can finally grow my melons again?" A few laughed. Ruth muttered something about vine management, and the moment melted into murmurs of relief. Someone asked who would lead the new council. A few voices suggested Frank. He shook his head gently. "This belongs to your generation now." He glanced toward Ellie. "I'll be here for questions, and tea, but the reins go forward, not back." Ellie felt a flush of warmth, part pride, part gravity. She nodded. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the backyard, the mood turned softer. Conversations turned to gardens, grandkids, and upcoming potlucks. No one rushed to leave. Near the edge of the yard, Ellie's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. An email. Subject, feature request, the lawyer next door. From, the Tampa Times. She looked up and saw Frank speaking with Ruth, his posture relaxed, one hand tucked into his pocket as he listened. For the first time in weeks, the lines around his eyes seemed lighter. Ellie smiled and slipped the phone into her pocket. The bees kept humming. The voices rose and fell. And Willow Creek, at last, exhaled. The spring sunlight warmed the newly quiet streets of Willow Creek, where lawn chairs were once again just chairs, and not symbols of protest. What began with a missing car became a turning point, not just for one man, but for a community that remembered its voice. In the end, it wasn't noise or anger that restored balance, but quiet persistence, shared purpose, and neighbors who chose transparency over silence. When power forgets it serves the people, it takes only one steady hand to remind it, gently and legally. Like a thread pulled from the edge of a tapestry, one small tug unraveled what no one had dared question for years.